Okay, here we are. So we are now on the history of Jerusalem, season 1, episode 3. So if you recall last time, what we did was we did a whole session on the walls of Jerusalem. I thought that the walls of Jerusalem were somewhat iconic and they told a bit of a story. And so we sort of explored Jerusalem through that particular lens. And we had we looked in particular at Ezra and Nehemia and some various parts of the wall which came from that time period. This time we're going to come to a bit of an inner circle, and we're also moving forward a little bit in history. And we're going to look at right now at temple builders after Solomon. And I actually discovered some very interesting things along the way. I'm very excited about this. Now, it could be that it's just me. I'm just nerdy enough to really appreciate this kind of stuff. And I hope that you are nerdy enough with me. I'm going to
I must be note.
Or actually, I'm going to mute everyone. And if you have a question, please don't hesitate to unmute. Okay, so here we go. If you were standing at the Kotel Maravi right now, you would see the following. You would see a wall that has a lot of different layers here. And you can see that the way in which this particular photograph sort of organizes them, you can see at the top, you have 3 courses by Sunni Muslim cleric sometime before 1967. And then you have 14 courses during the Ottoman period in 1866. And then you have 4 courses by the Umayyads of 600 AD. And the Umayyads were reusing certain parts of Herodian stone. But then you have 7 courses of Herodian ashlars from 19 BC. Now, this is a really important term that we're going to need to use. The term ashlar is going to refer to stones that look like this. Stones that look like this, that have that Herodian border. I'll get my drawing tool here. You see that border right there? There's a border right there. You can see it on this stone as well. These are Herodian ashlars. They're very, very typical and classic Herodian stones. And we're going to identify them and talk about them at some length as we go forward. But maybe one of the interesting things is when we talk about the Temple Mount, a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is the expansion of the Temple Mount. And fascinatingly, part of the expansion of the Temple Mount means that we have to get rid of a certain feature of the temple itself. So there's this part called the Ophel. So the Ophel, as you will see right here, Ophel, this was where Solomon's palace was. And this mound right here actually prevented the expansion of the temple courtyard outward. And so during the time of the Hashmonaim, this area was removed and sort of flattened out. So hopefully my animation works really well. You'll see this start to dissolve and fade away. So the area where Shlomo HaMelech had built his palace actually has to be taken away. And it was a mound that sat between the Temple Mount and the Ir David, the city of David. City of David is this area over here, is the city of David. And you can go there today. There's also a lot of excavation that's going on there right now. It's a very exciting place to be. Now, here's how we know that there are some expansions. One place is in Ezra and Nehemia. Now, remember, Ezra and Nehemia, the Jews are returning from Babylon, and we have these snapshots of all the Jews returning from Babylon gathering in one place. And it says, "Vayikpetzu kol anshe Yehuda v'Inyamin Yerushalayim l'shloshat hayamim u'chodesh hatshii be'esrim b'chodesh." So in the 9th month, in the 20th day of the month, Vayishvu kol ha'am, everybody sat, Birchov Beit Elohim, in the street of the house of God, Maridim al davar umehag shamim. Right? So they're trembling before God, and they sit in this broad place, Birchov Beit Elohim, in the street or the broad place of the house of God. So this sounds like it might be some larger courtyard. The Tanakh has a word for the courtyard of the Beit Hamikdash, but this might be a different place. And there is speculation that, in fact, there were expansions of the Temple Mount that took place over the course of centuries. Everybody agrees, everybody knows, and we have some very interesting documentation of the fact that Herod extended the Temple Mount. But what is fascinating is Herod is not the first one to do this. And the truth of the matter is, it would be very surprising for Herod to do this on his own without having a precedent before him. And we'll see why that would be, that Herod wouldn't do this on his own. Here you can sort of see a picture of the Temple Mount. The green portion here are the Herodian walls. This is actually looking at it from the opposite angle that we just looked at it, from the opposite angle of the Ophel. We are now looking east, or maybe we're looking northeast on this particular projection. The green walls are the Herodian, the current Herodian walls. So, if you will, the western wall as we know it is probably right around here. That's where your Temple Plaza sort of sits. Here's that Ophel, that same place that we said got removed and leveled out in order to make way for the expansion. And we'll see that there are different expansions. This may have been an expansion by the red may have been Simon Hyrcanus, and the yellow may have been Shimon HaTzadik. We'll take a look and see how all of that plays out together. And a lot of these projections come from a biblical archaeologist whose name is Lee Ridemeyer. Here's another of Ridemeyer's projections, just so you can see how do we know that all these things happen. So we can identify different kinds of stone when we look at the Temple Mount. This particular projection is looking, now we are looking west. We are standing on the east. We could be on the Mount of Olives, looking out towards the west, seeing the eastern face of the temple. And so you can see that he indicates that here we have Herodian masonry over in this section. We can see that we have Hasmonean masonry in this section. We can even see some visible masonry from the first temple period, right? The white is areas that we don't have, right? Over here, these are things that were destroyed, presumably by the Romans, right? Those are pieces of the wall that fell down, were pushed over, somehow destroyed. I want to show you sort of from an aerial view how we see this expansion and talk a little bit about what it might have meant. So here in this first little section, we have Nehemia. Over here is where Nehemia may have expanded the Temple Mount. If over here was the original courtyard of the temple, maybe Nehemia's courtyard extended a little bit further out here. And this was a modest expansion. And the reason it's a modest expansion is because there wasn't really a lot of resources in the days of Nehemia. I mean, they barely managed to get the wall together. So they may have done just a little bit of leveling. Maybe the grade wasn't so intense there at that stage of, and then we go to Shimon HaTzadik. Now, the question is, how do we know about all these expansions? How do we know that they happened? So the expansion by Shimon HaTzadik, and let me date Shimon HaTzadik for you. Shimon HaTzadik takes place before the Hanukkah story. So before the Hanukkah story, we have a text called Ben Sira, which talks about laying the foundations and also constructing a water reservoir. And we know also that that from the Antiquities Judaeus, from Josephus, that Antiochus III, now the evil Antiochus is Antiochus IV, right? So we're at an earlier Antiochus. One of the earlier Antiochus, he gave them permission to construct and level the temple courtyard. What we also know is that, so we assume that this expansion dates to the time of Shimon HaTzadik because of, again, some of these texts that tell us that Shimon HaTzadik did this. What is then interesting is that we also know that after the Maccabees took over, they fortified the walls a little bit because Judah the Maccabee was afraid that Antiochus was going to come back again, and he wanted to fortify the walls. Best way to keep away an invading army is have a good defense, right? We also know that, again, from the book of Maccabees, the book of Maccabees is a book that was written by Jews, by the Chashmonaim at the time of the Maccabees. The rabbis chose not to put the book of Maccabees into Tanakh. They said this is one of the apocrypha. It is not going to be one of the, it's called, what in rabbinic terminology, it's called Svarim Chitzonim. They're books that are outside of the Bible, but they're perfectly good historical records. And what we know is that when the Maccabees came back and started to rebuild, there was all sorts of problems on the Temple Mount. First of all, the altar was desecrated. The gates were burnt. And we know about the whole desecration and spiritual defilement. But one of the things that the book of Maccabees also records is that there was wild vegetation growing all over the place. And worse than that even is that there were these sort of houses of harlots that were using the Temple Mount for their craft, so to speak. And so there was a lot of cleaning up that needed to be done. The Chashmonaim, the Maccabees, are also have successive generations, and one of them is Yochanan Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus, and you can see that John Hyrcanus expands the temple courtyard significantly, and we know about this from both the documentation and the archaeological evidence that shows us that we have Hasmonean stonework that takes place in that area. So here, just this kind of gives you that sense. This is just labeled maybe a little bit better to be able to see how each successive expansion happened. Now, what?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? When you say that these guys expanded, were they using, like, do we know anything about the builders? Were they using slaves? Were they using Jewish builders? Like, what do we know about that?
Give me. I'm going to ask you to hold that question because I have some info on that. We'll get a little bit more detail. It depends on the period of time and on how much detail we have on that particular kind of thing. There's one fascinating detail about the Herodian builders, but I'll get to that in a little bit later. Okay.
Rabbi, can I
yes.
ask a question?
Yeah, certainly.
In the section that's contained within the yellow wall,
mm-hmm.
On this photo here, there seems to be towards the upper side of it, this sort of like it looks like a base of some sort, or
that?
a special, yes, that. What is that?
I believe that's topography. I believe that's just a topographical feature. That's where we'll find bedrock.
It's not the rock that is in
I'm not an expert on the rock. I didn't really drill down on that, so I can't say I know for sure, but I believe that these topographical maps are meant to show us where the bedrock lies, or just near where the natural features are. So it's very possible that the Dome of the Rock is right there, and that is in fact a rock. Maybe it's bedrock, maybe it's not bedrock, but it is a rock. So yes, you might be right that is the Dome of the Rock. I can't. What my goal in this class is to move through the periods of history. So since we are a good 800 years, 900 years from the Dome of the Rock, that did not factor into my research at this stage.
Thank you. Okay.
So, okay. So this is what, now, what is, I think I'm going to turn to you and going to say, what do we think this means from a sociological standpoint or a history of the Jewish people standpoint?
Well, it means that the economical situation was much better. The fact that they had time and money and inclination to invest in these massive building projects, I would say.
Okay, good. So first of all, right, building is a function of economy, right? So if you go to, I'm trying to think of a relatively poor country, but if you go to Haiti versus Monaco, right, you're going to see a different scale of building, right? If you go to Germany versus Haiti, you expect to see fantastic buildings in Germany and not so much in Haiti. And so that's absolutely the case. What else can you say about expansions?
Bigger populations, need to move
I
beyond
have to assume, right, that people expand based on need, right? We have to assume that there was a demand for this space, right? People wanted to come into this space. And we know that part of the project of Ezra and Nehemia was to take the Torah to the people, to reach out further. So it makes sense that Ezra and Nehemia may have expanded the courtyard because they wanted to bring more people in, right? Certainly the Hashmonaim want to demonstrate and they want to ensure a Jewish versus a Hellenistic presence, so they're going to expand even further. Now, though, I think we're going to get to a special sort of motivation for Herod. And now we get to speak about Herod the Great. So Herod the Great is of dubious Jewish descent. I'll show you the Talmudic text on that. But Herod the Great, his father is Idumean, which means he's from Edom. Presumably he converts, but that's hardly exactly, tracing yourself back to, the Davidic line. His grandfather's not the Vilna Gaon. Even though I'm speaking anachronistically, he doesn't have such good yichus, as we say. So what does Herod do? He falls in love with his woman Miriam, and her father was just a mere Alexandrian Cohen. So Herod promotes him to be Kohen Gadol and then marries her. Now he's the son-in-law of the Kohen Gadol. Now, part of this is a very important piece, and that is that Herod is trying to improve his stock, but it also speaks to another problem. In the days of Herod comes essentially on the heels of the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty had merged the position of Kohen Gadol and king, and there's a solid argument to be said that the person who controls the temple controls the people. Alexander Yanai, for example, had a lot of trouble because he tried to stamp out the rabbis, otherwise known as the Pharisees, the Prushim, and it never really worked for him. And his wife and successor, Shlomtzion HaMalka, was actually a great defender of the rabbis. And I think, according to Josephus, that was part of Yanai's sort of parting wisdom, is that embrace the rabbis. They're the secret to the power, right? You want to be able to hold the people. And so Herod knows that he needs to curry favor with the rank and file, and he needs to elevate his own stature. He knows he can't be Kohen Gadol. That's non-starter. But what he can do is he can enter into the family of the Kohen Gadol by marrying the daughter of the person he promotes to be Kohen Gadol. This is the Talmud in Baba Batra, which tells a very similar story to Josephus, just slight differences. It says, Herod was a servant of the Hasmoneans, and there was a girl among them who he cast his eyes upon, and one day he heard a voice saying, a servant who should rebel now would succeed. So he rose and slew all his masters, but spared that girl. When he saw that he intended to marry her, she ascended to the roof and raised her voice. She proclaimed, whoever comes and claims himself descended from the Hasmonean, be it known that he is a servant, for all the Hasmoneans were slain except for myself, right? And I am now throwing myself from this roof to the ground. So then it talks about Herod preserving her body, all sorts of funny things. Herod has some weird, this could be an amalgamation of some idiosyncratic things having to do with Herod, which I don't want to get into. But the point is that the Talmud understands that Herod has to connect himself to the Hashmonaim. That's part of gaining power. But if we can see in the same light Herod as the master builder, because Herod has this bid that he needs to establish popularity with the Jewish people. And so in the year 23-22, he undertook to rebuild the temple. Now, the temple itself took 18 months to build, right? Just the temple itself, that was a relatively easy project. But the porticos and the expansion of the courtyard, that took 8 years. That just gives you a sense of how different in scope those projects were. But before I get in too deep into this, I just want to say, first of all, that the Jews initially, when Herod announced that he was going to do this, were quite suspect of him. They said, "Oh, you're going to tell us that you're going to rebuild the temple, but really, this is just a ploy to destroy it, right? That you're going to fake rebuilding it so you can destroy it." And, they were very nervous about that. Just to show you how Herod was himself very sensitive to Jewish issues, Herod's coins do not have busts of Herod. Now, Herod did not suffer from a lack of vanity. He liked a good image of himself as much as the next guy. But what you see from Herod is that he did not want to put human images on coins, because that is something which always set the Jews on edge. So Herod, in the half pruta coin here, this is an eagle, and this is a cornucopia. Cornucopia was one of the images of the Chashmonaim. Similarly, the 8 pruta coin, this is the helmet, another symbol of the Chashmonaim, and this is a tripod. So again, he's not using any of the symbols of, at least of his own face. You can just here's just a little bit of what Herod's 8 pruta coin looks like. There's the H of Herod, and if you read it along this way, it reads Herod of Basileus. Okay, now, one of the most fascinating things that we find in the ruins of the temple is a stone inscription. This, we assume that Josephus tells us that it also existed in Latin. Only the Greek one has been found. This is the Greek one. And it essentially says, Gentiles are forbidden to enter after this point. A Gentile is not allowed to go into the courtyard of the temple itself, but the expanded platform that Herod built does allow for non-Jews to come in there. And what's interesting is Herod is constrained. As we said, Herod very much wants to follow the rabbis. Herod is building this structure to please the Jews. We'll put more evidence behind that claim in a few minutes. But Herod is building this in order to please the Jews, but he also has another audience in mind as well. He wants non-Jews to see this as one of the wonders of the world. He wants them to be impressed by his amazing architecture. And so the porticos inside of the temple there's no dictates of that didn't exist in the days of Shlomo. And since it didn't exist in the days of Shlomo, Herod obviously has a little bit more flexibility to build that as he wishes. And you'll see this is the head of a Corinthian column. Corinthian columns are not something you find in the Talmud. It's not something you find in the Chumash. You don't find it in Yechezkel. You don't find it in Divrei Hayamim. You don't find it in Melachim. This is a clear Greek-Roman feature of architecture. And the inside of the temple is going to be essentially decorated in this way. There is clearly an attempt to blend both the inside and the outside. And he's trying to both satisfy the Jewish needs by making a kosher temple according to the laws that the Torah and the rabbis are going to lay out for him. But he's also going to try and merge this with another piece, which is creating a truly impressive spectacle. Now, Des, back to your question. Herod trains Kohanim to be carpenters and masons because he does not want any secular foot to tread upon the holy spaces of the Biet Hamikdash. So it was not let's put it this way. In the more sensitive parts of the Biet Hamikdash, it was not slave labor. We're a little bit later, we're going to look at where the heavy lifting was. And when I say heavy lifting, I mean heavy lifting.
Agnes is coughing.
What's that? Oh. So we're going to get to the heavy lifting, but that is we know that in the sensitive areas, Josephus tells us that he trained the Kohanim to do that work. Now, just to give you a sense of how successful Herod was, here's Pliny the Elder, who lives maybe a generation or so after Herod. And he says, Jerusalem is easily the most outstanding city in the East, and the temple was not the least of its glories. And the Talmud more or less echoes that. It says, it was said that he who had not seen the temple of Herod had never in all his life seen a fine building. With what material did he build it? The Rabbah said, with ornamental marble colored white and green, and some say colored blue, white, and green, and the stones not being in a straight line, but alternately projecting, receding, the gaps being intended to receive the lime. And so the Talmud will go on to say that it looked like waves and it had a very special impression. The reason I share this source with you is I just want you to see that Herod, this temple was meant to be impressive. And when you look at it, this is an impressive building. If you lived in the first century, this was as good as it got. This is, this is like the towers in Dubai, right, of the world. This is a really impressive building. And here you can see the porticos that are part of the expanded courtyard. Over here you have this is the area where you need Kohanim. This is the area where the Gentiles are not allowed to walk. This is also the area that would be very problematic if you go to the wrong place on Temple Mount, that you can be in real spiritual trouble, which is why many of the ultra-Orthodox strongly advocate against going up the Temple Mount. It's why many Orthodox Jews are happy to say, look, until Mashiach comes, the Waqf can manage the Temple Mount, and we're happy praying at the Western Wall. That's a whole other debate, etc. We'll perhaps get to that at another time. But to summarize what all of this means, I think there's a very interesting, I wanted to take her words exactly. E. Mary Smallwood is a scholar of Roman history. She wrote a wonderful book called Jews Under Roman Rule, from Pompey to Diocletian. And this is what she writes at the end of the Herod section. Herod's policy of Hellenization did not entail the suppression of Judaism, but rather the breakdown of Jewish exclusiveness and aloofness by a fusion of Hellenism with Judaism. What she's going to say is Herod didn't have to take on the rules. He wasn't fighting the battle of Antiochus, Hellenism versus Judaism. He just said Hellenism can live with Judaism. And so that you have Corinthian columns in the middle of a classic Jewish structure that is patterned after the descriptions in the book of Kings, the book of Yechezkel, and the book of Divrei Hayamim. But I think that this speaks to something. It speaks to this idea that Roman culture began to sort of seep in around the edges into what was an otherwise pure Jewish culture. And so it's important to start to see that piece, just to understand the evolution of the society, the evolution of how this place is meant to be, and to understand that the stones of the wall of the Kotel HaMa'aravi, they're about as Jewish a symbol as you get, but they're also about as Roman as you get in terms of style. Just demonstrating to you that Herod was very interested in pleasing the Jews. He also built this, Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the Cave of the Patriarchs, has the same kind of stone. This one obviously wasn't destroyed. And you get the sense of the intact grandeur of this. So we've sort of up until this point talked about the why. Why did Herod do this? And so I think the answer is that Herod had a certain sense of insecurity about being accepted as the Jewish king. One of the ways to do that was to bestow his beneficence upon the Jews by building them a first-class temple and maybe some other structures like the Ma'arat HaMachpelah. The question, though, that I think is really worth asking is how? How is almost as interesting as why. So first of all, so here's another picture of the ashlars. And these ashlars were all the retaining walls. Now, these retaining walls were built with dry construction. There is no cement between them. And these are impressive pieces of work. So this one is the largest stone that we know of. It's 40 feet or 12.2 meters. Its height is 12 feet high or 3.7 meters. And its width, the width of the retaining wall was 15 feet, 4.3, 4.4 meters. The largest of these, which is pictured here, you can see that I've indicated with the white line, you have that 40-foot run. So this stone weighs 600 tons, which for reference is 2 jumbo jets. To this day, they don't know how this was actually put together or how put in place. We'll show you some of the technology that was used, but it's still very difficult to figure out exactly how they got this particular stone in place. Also, these stones are laid with tremendous precision. Each one is inset, maybe a centimeter or so from the one below it. And because the Romans knew that if you build a wall straight up, you have this optical illusion of a wall falling on you. And so it is built with a very slight taper towards the top. How did they cut these stones? So here, this is again from Ridemeyer, and basically they would chisel out the area around the stone, and then they would put logs in between the stone and its mate next to it. This is a limestone quarry. And they would then add water, and the wood would swell. And this is sort of a very typical slow-acting device. But the water swells, the capillary action expands the wood, and even the stone cannot suppress that action, and it cracks off its base. And they would score it on the bottom so that it would crack in the right place. And that's how you would get a very neat stone. Then they would put it on rollers, sort of like a treadmill, and they would hitch up oxen and they would roll it down. And typically these would they would take them from higher elevations to lower elevations. Here's a picture of a Roman crane that was reconstructed in Bonn, Germany. So just so you know, this is not one that we know at the Temple Mount, but I wanted to give you this idea of what the Roman cranes looked like and what they were able to do. And here you can see this outjutting of a little, you see that little knob on there? The same one here. That little knob was left for us for posterity. They needed, you ever try to move like a chest of drawers, like a dresser? Sometimes it's really hard because there's nothing to hold on to. And so they left these nodules to hold on to, and the masons would chisel that off at the end and smooth it down. And they didn't leave most of them, but this one they left, so we would know how that would work. Now, some of the ashlars weigh as many as, like we know that the ones at the base weigh 600 tons, but there's some that are 100 feet off of the floor of the road, and they weigh 70 tons. So this, first of all, tells us a little bit about how they got them into place. Is that they would first fill in, this is a very bad drawing, I'm sorry about that. They would first fill in the infill, and then they would, once you were up to grade, then they would move it along with the oxen. But they didn't build the wall first and then fill. They filled first and then completed the wall. so that you did those somewhat simultaneously, so you could move some of these very heavy things, and they're still, relative to where your road is, they're very, very high. They're very, very high up. I'm sorry I couldn't get a larger image of this. Over here is a crane. These are oxen, and you can sort of see that these are the areas where they're filling in. One of the interesting features about this, the way that they've done this, is they created a vault system underneath. And so there are a series of structural vaults underneath that hold up the infill. So it's not all like moving dirt. There's some real structure underneath. There are even some secret passages and various pieces there. But, Des, when you ask who built this stuff, I don't think you had Kohanim who were doing this kind of heavy schlepping, right? And I told you it was going to be heavy lifting. Like when we talk about heavy lifting, this is the very definition of heavy lifting. So I want to just end with one last feature that Herod brings to this fortress, and that is the Antonia fortress. So Herod, part of what gets Herod his special position is his unique relationship with Mark Antony. And ultimately, he's going to have to switch sides to Augustus. But this fortress is named after Mark Antony. And this fortress is on the northern side of the temple. And it is interesting. I think you can see here that there are doorways that lead onto the top of the porticos. This was clearly, when you introduce a military piece to the temple, you are saying, well, I may not be the Kohen, but I can control this space. And one of the things that Herod actually did to actively control that was they stored the Bigdei Kahuna in the Antonia fortress. And what that means is that if Herod wanted to prevent the Jews from carrying out the services of the temple, he could do so, because without the Bigdei Kahuna, they're toast. You can't do your temple rituals without that, without the clothes of the Kohanim and the Kohen Gadol. And so this is an interesting feature. This is not something which the rabbis prescribed, but rather, again, here you have the mix of politics and religion. And so what to me is very interesting here is that the grandeur of the Biet Hamikdash, that everyone sees as an amazing edifice, amazing building that was the beating heart of the center of the Jewish people, came with some interesting strings attached, right? It came with a Hellenization, and it also came with a dangerous mix between religion and politics, right? When you start putting armed guards next to your temple, you can see Herod was, what they say of Herod is you would rather be his pig than his son, because Herod was smart enough not to eat pork because he knew that it would offend the Jews, that would offend the masses, but he did kill his own children. And so he was, you might say he was a well-functioning sociopath. And so the building of the temple is obviously then complicated by this expansion which takes place under the rule of this very controversial figure from a Jewish perspective, right? We don't know if he's really a king. He might not really have been Jewish, and he's doing a lot of things to try to curry favor with the Jews, but at the same time, he is not a sycophant, right? He is not going to roll over. He literally builds a fortress to control this entity that he built. So I guess that brings us to the end of this particular chapter of our Jewish history episode, the history of Jerusalem. We've now gotten to the point where we have built the temple. I guess in our next episode, we're going to have to learn about it coming down. All right, so I'm happy to answer any questions that remain.
Well, One thing that I remember reading a long time ago, so this is not a question but a comment, because I asked you who had built a lot of the stuff. And I remember reading that one of the reasons for the Jews revolting against the Romans was after Herod had completed the temple, many tens of thousands of Jews lost their jobs because the work on the temple was finished and they didn't have work anymore. And following the building of the temple, the completion of the temple, there's a terrible economic downturn because there's no more work.
As there are almost 100 years between those two events. You know, let's say that the temple is finished being built in, you know, minus 14, and the Great Revolt starts at 66
Right,
and
yeah.
14. It's 80 years.
Yeah, no, good point. Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm not so sure that, I mean, it's a nice theory, but I'm not sure if there's really a lot of evidence behind it.
And the other question I had was Shimon HaTzadik the guy who went out to meet Alexander the Great when he took over Jerusalem? Was he the guy who did that? In his robe, Alexander the Great bowed down to him because he had a vision of him in his dreams. Have I got the right story?
Maybe I'm not sure. I have to. I'm not. That one's not on the top of my. You know, I'm not having that on recall. I remember something vaguely about that, but I have to look that up.
Because if it is a right story, that would put Shimon HaTzadik alive at about 300 BC, I think, which is when Alexander conquered Jerusalem.
That would be a little bit, a little bit earlier than that, because this is closer to 200 BC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe
Yes.
I'm mixing.
Sheila.
When Herod built Masada, there were no just a second, ashlar stones there, right? Or were there?
So the ashlars are, I mean, they're quarried limestone. And by the way, interestingly enough, reading another book about some I don't know, it's about the age of wood and development of wooden tools. But in the book, he references that limestone actually comes from these compressed like crustaceans and different things. So it's a very different kind of stone. I don't know whether limestone is quarried is easy to quarry in the Dead Sea area. So it could be that. Also, you don't, for Masada, maybe you didn't need big ashlar retaining walls, or because Masada, what happens here is you're bringing ashlars from higher elevations down into the temple, onto the temple courtyard. Even though it seems high, it's actually lower than some of the limestone quarries. And it's hard enough to walk up Masada. Schlepping an ashlar up there could be, you know, I'm just speculating. I don't know, but I'm guessing that's those. It could be that there's not limestone in the area, and B, it's not practical to bring it up.
Well, apparently they use the ramps on the back side, like.
Yeah, but the ramps are you know, the siege ramps are made of, you know, very different kinds of materials.
Rabbi, I'm wondering, where are the gates? Are they in the inner courtyard or the outer courtyard?
Which gates?
You know, Shara, what is it? Shara Katan, Shara Gvura, Shara Nitzot, Shara, all the different gates.
So they're okay. So they're here. Just it's a bad drawing. It's a bad drawing, but here in the Kahati version of Masechet Midot, you here. Let me stop my share so you can see it maybe slightly better resolution. So here, okay. So I'm sorry I don't have this actual image for you, but you
Yeah,
can
that's
see
perfect.
there's
That's
7
perfect.
gates. There's 7 gates. Sorry, there are 5 gates on the to the outer courtyard. Like so, and those gates are Shar Shushan, which is the one to the east. There is Shar Chulda, which is I think on the western side, and then here's the courtyard of the Biet Hamikdash, right? And here you have many other gates, and there are too many actually to name
Yeah.
in terms of all the gates that go in there. So you have to look at tremendous detail to see all of that. And this particular the view that I showed you, I think is actually pictures of the Holy Land Hotel model. It doesn't do the gates real
No,
justice.
I'm wondering if it's in the inner courtyard or the outer perimeter of the retaining wall. The gates are there on the
So
inner.
there are gates to both. The answer is they both have gates, right? So
Oh.
the retaining wall has the Shar Chulda, the Shar Shushan. The Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Midot, it says tells us, that there are 5 gates to Har Habayit, and then it tells us how many gates, and they're you're right. Chamisha sharim hayu lahar habayit. There are 5 gates to Har Habayit. Shnei shari chulda, the 2 gates of chulda from the south, etc. And then and it says shiva sharim haya ba'azar. There are 7 gates in the courtyard, 3 in the north, 3 in the south, 1 in the east, etc. So
Yeah.
and they all have names, and each one has its own story. And
They're the inside rectangle versus the outer.
so the
one.
inside rectangle has 5, and the outer rectangle has 7.
Mhm, okay. So 13 altogether. Okay.
Yeah. So, all right, Tov. Thank you all for joining. I aim these to be a half an hour, but I guess people stay interested. So, you can message me later if you think I took too long.
No, you did not. You
No,
did
you
not.
didn't.
Okay.
Nobody left.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Pleasure.
Yes,
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Everyone have a good night.
Good night.